Welcome back to our channel where we provide updates and undisclosed narratives on the royal family. We provide you with the exciting news royal. In shock, Princess Anne shuts down Camilla's grab for royal symbols. An insider reports that Princess Anne has one final action to take against Camilla after informing King Charles about Camilla's actions that violated the late Queen's will. King Charles is said to not be listening to Princess Anne. This means that Princess Anne has one last chance to expose everything Camilla has done to the late Queen's will. After Queen Elizabeth II died, Britain went through a lengthy, quiet exhale. People were quiet in the streets and in public places. Flowers and cards piled up outside palaces. And the country's discussions turned, as they often do after a death of such national importance, to memory and meaning. At the same time, the royal family was quietly trying to do what all monarchs must do at some point: turn their grief into the everyday activities that keep an institution going. On the surface, the story was one of continuity, the usual dance of succession, crowns, vows, and grandeur. But behind that, the palace was adapting to a new layout at home. A monarchy is a public symbol and a family with injuries, sorrow, and governance that occasionally get in the way of each other. The focus was on steadiness in public. People thought that the next king should inherit not just a title, but also a legacy that many believed characterized their life. The family has a much harder time with symbols in private. A monarchy's authority comes from both laws and things like robes, carriages, pictures, and diamonds. The crowns and diadems are the heaviest of the things. They have history and meaning, and they show the markings of the men and women who wore them. For long-serving courtiers who had spent decades caring for both rituals and items with equal care, each piece had personal meaning, like a family treasure. Therefore, when someone proposed a crown for the Queen Consort to wear during her initial ceremonial appearances with King Charles III, it resonated deeply. For many people, the crown in question had come to symbolize the whole rule. Given its connection to the late Queen, some staff members considered it sacred. But for others, the new court had to have a new rhythm with new symbols that showed a succession instead of a halt. The palace's machinery began to hum. They made and remade plans. The logistics of security, ceremony, and statecraft were handled in both grand and secret rooms, such as the offices of senior courtiers, the vaulted stores where ceremonial robes slept between uses, and the tower's jewel house, where the crown jewels are displayed, guarded, and cared for when they are not on public display. Elizabeth had employed many of the people who worked there for decades. They knew every clasp and hinge, every scarred stone, and every piece of velvet that had been worn down. When word got out that the Queen Consort was going to wear one of the late Queen's most personal and well-known crowns to a big occasion, the people in that group were quite upset. There was sadness in the answer, but it was mixed with duty. To them, the crown was more than just a piece of jewelry. It had been there for 70 years throughout state visits, jubilees, family picture sittings, and photos that had become famous. Giving that sign to a new generation, especially to someone who had just been named Queen Consort, was perceived by many as bringing a lineage into the present, rather than allowing it to stand alone as a time that characterized an era. Some traditionalists who had quietly preserved Elizabeth's visual legacy believed that seeing that particular diadem on someone else's head so soon was a violation of the etiquette they felt should govern the use of royal items. It wasn't just nostalgia, it was a belief in the importance of a public past and how symbols keep that history alive. Even so, the palace's resources are intended to maintain a sense of calm. Many top personnel dedicated themselves to ensuring the smooth transition. They had put in a lot of time and effort into rehearsals and briefings, planning out every entry and where every hand would go on a rail. But in private, they spoke about how their worries were growing. Some confided that when they imagined the crown being placed on another woman's head for the first set of public appearances, it felt irreverent, a rush to claim imagery that ought to have the space of time around it for proper transition. Some people said that the Queen Consort had earned a public position by marriage in a long time of public service. Therefore, it wasn't unreasonable for her to wear some of the outward signs of her office. The conflicts were the same as always between being true to history and meeting the requirements of a live institution, between the atmosphere of a grieving country and the stagecraft needed to calm it down. Some people believed that Camilla was self-assured, while others felt she had a right to be that way. The gems she saw and wore weren't just for show. They were props in a play that changed every time a new king or queen came to power. There were rumors going around the tower that she had been practicing with the diadem in secret. People who worked at the jewel house, their voices full of worry, said they had observed Camilla putting on the jewelry, testing its weight, and rehearsing her posture. People who had polished the same crown for years thought it was wrong for her to do so. It wasn't against the law, but it was against their culture. Others believed that the image of a new head, fitting into the crown, which was closely associated with Elizabeth, represented a public exhibition that clashed with the prevailing sense of loss. Rumors spread quickly through the palace's hallways and servants' rooms like a little fire. The home whose members are close to each other and have a strict hierarchy is a good place for gossip to turn into strong beliefs. People choose sides. There were loyalists on one side who thought the king should always back his wife. On another seat, Elizabeth's devoted servants felt a protective nostalgia. The divide wasn't only a work-related issue, it also affected personal loyalties and the family's private moral economy, which had traditionally been both private and public. Princess Anne viewed these events as if from the bulwark of old experience. She had a well-known reputation for being strict, hard-working, and different from her contemporaries in that she was both forthright and devoted to her work. Anne had always been practical when it came to royal life. She was the working royal who did her duties, and she did them in a way that made the more showy members of her family appear weak by contrast. She had also been a devoted daughter and had seen personally how important it was to represent. People who had seen her over the months of transition saw that she was taking the issue seriously, which made them think it wasn't just another ceremonial quarrel. She stayed away from gossip and public statements, but her presence transformed the way people spoke. When she walked into the room, everyone stopped talking in the middle of a sentence, and the discussion became quiet. People who had known her for a long time knew her face to be completely neutral. But when conversations turned to the crown, some said her look became so intense that it was almost painful. She started going to the area around the jewel house, not during Camilla's practices, but in a manner that showed she was interested. Her actions were slow and careful. That she cared at all made the situation more serious. When Anne, who didn't often act, showed worry, other courtiers paid notice. There were reports of Anne talking to trusted people in the home, talking to her brother in private, and saying that she was worried that something vital was being hurried. Charles, the new king, who harbored a deep affection for his mother, found himself torn between the two most important women in his life. For decades, he had been managing a difficult personal past in the public arena. Now, in the months following his rise to power, he was striving to reconcile those personal duties. People knew that he would sometimes go back and forth in private between supporting his wife's feelings and admitting that his sister's concerns were based on the weight of the institution. People tried to reach a consensus in quiet hallways and private talks, but as the ceremonial calendar became shorter and shorter, with just the planned ceremonies to mark the start of the new reign, it became evident to many that Camilla's preparations were going ahead. At this level, conflict doesn't always show up as loud arguments. Instead, it might show up as discreet acts of avoidance, flexible schedules, and carefully planned entrances that keep two individuals apart. To ease the strain, palace personnel started to stagger. Contacts moved briefings and separate rehearsals. When Camilla and Anne did meet, they were polite to each other, which is how people act in public organizations, where looks are a type of power. People who saw said that Camilla's smiles occasionally appeared forced, whereas Anne's calmness was unwavering, and she frequently didn't smile. People who had worked with Anne saw her calmness not as acceptance, but as a slow-building persistence. They believed that Anne was gathering facts and allies rather than merely protesting without purpose. As the date of the engagement became closer, whispers among footmen and housekeepers turned into more solid stories. The tale they presented wasn't just one story. It was a collection of stories that all had a similar pattern. It was about Gerard & Co., the historic crown jewelers who had restored and changed royal treasures to fit modern demands throughout the years. Reports said that jewelers had been testing with the diadem and that little alterations were being explored for the crown's frame to help it fit better on Camilla's head. Anne thought these changes were more than simply useful fixes. She thought of them as a way to erase history changing a crown so that someone else may wear it, constituted in her mind, stealing a piece of history and changing its immediate biography. She thought that the idea of softening metalwork to fit a new user was like changing not only the materials themselves, but also memory itself. Anne did not get angry in public. She had witnessed the ease with which tabloid stories could emerge from intimate family fights or dismiss them as personal grudges. She opted instead to follow a strict set of rules and show obvious restraint. It became clearer that she was there at important times. It seemed that private requests, quiet talks with the king, and covert pleas to high-ranking courtiers didn't get her what she thought was a solution. She started to make the point that it wasn't just a question of personal choice. It was also about how her mother felt about how her heritage items were being handled. In the palace where even stillness speaks, Anne's silence became louder. Then only a few days before the ceremony was supposed to happen, the fight went from quiet to loud. The palace is a site where accidental meetings are important, since it has big rooms and little hallways. Camilla went to the jewel room for what would be her last private rehearsal on a late evening, when the halls were quiet and the servants looked to be giving the house a break. She couldn't go beyond the corner she turned. Princess Anne stood in front of the entrance, arms crossed and face set like a statue. At first, Camilla laughed off Anne's interference, saying that Anne had a flair for theatrics. But the chuckle didn't make things better. Anne stayed still. Instead, she talked gently, but with an edge that made the hallway seem so close that you could hear a pin drop. She answered, "That doesn't belong to you." It wasn't a question, it was a statement. The exchange got out of hand fast. Anne told Camilla that she was not being mean. Rather, she was dishonoring their mother by touching the tangible symbol of a rule that many still believed was in effect. The intensity of the moment drew in people who had stopped at the doorway to listen. The carefully planned picture of togetherness that the family had worked hard to create over the years to calm the people and keep the state stable started to break down in public in a manner that it seldom did. Typically calm, Camilla retaliated. Hurt and anger came out when she accused Anne of being envious and not being able to accept the changes that needed to be made to the royal household. In other instances, the argument escalated to near-screaming levels. The event reached a point that was both dramatic and real. It was like a play had reached its conclusion and a prop was about to be unveiled. Anne took an envelope out of her jacket. The royal seal was on it, and the wax had the same imprint as the late Queen's cipher. She stated she had discovered it among Elizabeth's personal documents. Giving an envelope in a public place was a basic, everyday action that achieved what the debate couldn't. It turned the disagreement from memory and sensation into something that seemed real and genuine. Anne read the letter out loud slowly and clearly as she unfolded it. Many people in the household knew that the Queen's private letters were short and to the point, and they seemed to have written instructions on what to do with the diadem. Anne examined the letter and saw that it clearly asked for something. Elizabeth wanted the Queen Consort to not wear the particular crown, but instead save it for the future marriage of her direct heir. The way it was worded made it seem like they wanted to maintain certain symbols from Elizabeth's time and pass others on in a set order. The letter's phrasing stressed the idea that some photographs should be untouched right after her death, and that there should be consistency in a specific line of images. People gasped in the hallway. Camilla's behavior, which had been so angry only a minute before, changed. Her initial response, claiming the letter was a fake, sounded like a lady who was in a tight spot and needed help. But anybody who had read Elizabeth's letters would have noticed that the writing was Elizabethan, a hand that was slightly tilted, and a love of certain phrases that had been used in private notes for decades. For many people, the document's existence was clear. They brought the king. When Charles read the letter, his expression showed a range of emotions. He went from sad to disappointed to determined. For the first time, he could see and feel the tensions that had been building up over the preceding several weeks. Anne didn't just provide the letter for personal gain. She spoke about the Queen's desires as if they were a moral lesson, and the fact that she had the letter in her hand made it difficult to argue against the moral assertion. She said that wearing the crown against her intentions would be a breach not just of her wants but also of the trust of an elder. Camilla would not give up. Now her argument changed from moral to legal and ceremonial logistics. She added that if the letter was real, it may show a personal preference, but it couldn't force the reigning king and household officials to make judgments on ceremonies. She spoke loudly enough for the personnel around her to hear, "It's a sentimental wish. It's not a royal command." In the heat of the moment, she made personal allegations. The conversation went from institutional dispute to personal complaint. Camilla spoke about how she had been humiliated in public and how much attention she had received, begging that she had earned her position by years of devotion and commitment. Anne didn't respond with anger. Instead, she stared at him without blinking, showing that she was morally confident, like a judge's decision in a chamber without judges. But the fight didn't stop that night. The argument's aftershocks kept moving down the halls and into private sitting rooms. The next day, Anne made another step. This one was less dramatic, but maybe more powerful. At a gathering with important family members and courtiers, she brought out a little velvet box. When opened, it showed a tiara that the late queen had allegedly preserved in her vault. It was ancient, fragile, and had diamonds and pearls on it. Anne said that the queen had given it to her in the latter days of her life, along with instructions that were both practical and personal. Anne said that Elizabeth used the words "for the one who carries my heart" in private to allude to Catherine. It was written within the band of the tiara. The connotation was personal. The queen regarded Catherine not just as a possible wife for a future heir, but also as someone she could trust with her feelings and motherly love. The exhibition of the tiara was like anointing Elizabeth as the lady who would become the mother of the future king. It was a clear and tangible means of showing that Elizabeth cared about and preferred her. Camilla, who had just entered the room, spotted Catherine clutching an item. The color left her face. The gesture hurt her more than anything else could. She exited the room without looking anybody in the eye, and it was clear that she had lost. But the fight wasn't over yet. That night, Camilla went to her husband's study and gave him an ultimatum. She begged and threatened Charles to make a public declaration in favor of her right to wear the crown, saying that only royal support could stop the argument and the shame it had caused. She threatened him that if he didn't openly back her, she would quit the royal family and tell the world things about the family that would hurt them. It was a danger to the institution she had been a part of for years, a promise to let the world see the family's private life, which might be very upsetting. Charles was in a lot of pain because he was torn between his deep attachment to his wife and his moral duty to his sister. Princess Anne walked into the study before Charles could speak, as if she had known what Camilla was going to do and wanted to be a part of the conversation. She didn't try to make others feel bad. Instead, she made a counter-offer. If Charles gave in to Camilla's demand, she would give the letter from their mother to the worldwide press, and the people would decide. "Let the world choose," she said. "Let them see what she wanted." The danger of exposure was not only a legal issue. It was a moral weapon in a family that had always needed some seclusion to keep their personal and public lives separate. For a time, the three of them stood still, a king caught between the demands of devotion and truth, a sister determined to respect a mother who could no longer speak, and a wife who felt entitled to the symbols of the position she had fought so hard to fill. It was in a sense a normal family fight, but the stakes were very high for their institution. But the palace is both a family and a government, and in that context, little problems may quickly turn into big ones. Then in private, Camilla broke in a manner that was new to her. The stress of the day and the continual scrutiny wore her down. She started to weep. In those cries, she found a reason to wear the crown that she thought would make her feel better. She spoke about a private talk she said she had with the late queen. Camilla said that Elizabeth had told her about her worries about Catherine and the strain she would be under, and even hinted at the perils that had befallen Princess Diana, a cautionary tale in a family that had already experienced public tragedy. Camilla stated that the queen had implied that she might be required to protect the dynasty and maintain stability in the event of Catherine's failure. Camilla said that wearing the crown was not a sign of vanity, but a responsibility. It was a method to protect the family and the institution in case of danger. It was an arresting confession. It didn't have the steely evidence of a sealed letter, but it brought back an emotional reality about how the late queen was considered the family's lodestone, someone whose words could be understood in many ways. Anne rejected Camilla's frame, arguing that it transformed a private sense of pity into an implied permission to take something. The king was worn out and felt that the last choice was weighing on him. He took a long time to make up his mind, longer than anybody else in the room was comfortable with. In those minutes, you could see that he was carrying the weight of both his family and his job. He didn't speak to scold, he talked to settle. He admitted that the argument had hurt the family and that the wounds were now evident in a manner that may make them less stable. He understood how serious the letter was and opted to respect that. He determined that the queen consort would not wear the crown. He would follow Elizabeth's desires, which she wrote in a letter. Camilla felt hurt by the choice. She knew the law, a monarch's choice of ceremonial preparations, was an exercise of prerogative, and the late queen's letter, however sincere, could not in a formal sense bind the living king. But the emotional weight of the event and the way the family had come together behind Anne's intervention made it seem pointless to refuse. Camilla stepped back from the preparations without making a fuss. Her staff was urged in a low voice to change their plans. The importance of her involvement in the ceremonies would diminish, and her public appearances would undergo alterations. Anne's win, which also meant a victory for Elizabeth's time, wasn't a cause for celebration. The royal family's little map of their home had been cut in half. Charles's relationship with his sister was never the same again. After the verdict, he didn't look at her with appreciation. Instead, he looked at her with something more complicated, an understanding that principle had been served, but at a social cost. On the other hand, Camilla experienced public humiliation and private shaking. This incident made some people believe that the royal family, which has to be together and trusted by the public, had a fresh crack that would be difficult to fix. Catherine and Prince William, who had mostly stayed out of the public eye, were pulled into the symbolic resolve. Catherine, calm and respectful, took the tiara and the spot in the late queen's secret bequest that Anne had pointed out. The tiara, with its personal inscription, was a public display of love that put Catherine in a line of people who were both trusted and in power. For many people, it was a sign not of victory, but of a hoped-for continuity, a quiet handing of the late queen's mantle to a younger generation she had trusted in secret. After that, the palace reset. Plans for the ceremony were changed. People who were worried that the new reign's early visual language may blend in with the old one were at least somewhat relieved by the choice. But the fight left scars that were felt in the hallways, discreet alterations in the workplace, the moving of private sitting areas, and the rearranging of domestic chores that needed to be done at different times of the year. People who used to have no trouble moving around each other suddenly had to work around the pain. The tale had a less dramatic trajectory in public than what was really going on. The monarchy's machinery, which included PR discretion and careful placement of public images, made things easier for everyone to understand. Royal comments stressed the importance of unity and following the desires of the late queen. The palace wanted to tell the story of an organization that could settle differences among its members with grace and finality. But behind the walls, staff members who had been involved in the fight still murmured. Some people felt justified that Elizabeth's personal preferences were taken into account, while others thought the paragraph sadly showed the limitations of the family's ability to govern themselves. Long-term, the experience left its imprint. The management of regalia and symbolic inheritance throughout successions consistently serves as a benchmark for the monarchy's adaptation. Some courtiers believed that the event aimed to strengthen tradition, which holds that certain artifacts possess historical significance and should be treated with care that honors their previous connections. Some people said the fight showed how the house needed to change new reigns, needed to create sets of symbols that honor the past and work for the present. The palace as an organization kept doing its job. The calendar was full with events, programs were revised, and draperies were hung. People in the nation kept talking about what the monarchy should be like during peaceful times. The expense was more personal for the family. Once trust is broken, it takes a long time to restore. The fight over a piece of metal and the stone had turned into a wound about who had the right to tell a story and mold public memory. It had put two powerful women against each other, the late queen's daughter and the woman who would become her successor as queen consort. The fight was less about fashion and more about power and legacy. At the heart of it all was a king who had to choose between love and duty at a moment that would become part of the family's secret history. Life in the palace got back into a new routine over the next several months. A carefully planned sequence of pictures continued the festivities, aiming to calm the populace. The crown was kept and the lady wore the tiara that the late queen had obviously liked. The household went on as usual. Still, the hallways sometimes echoed with the recollection of the fight, the reading of the envelope, and the despair that followed. People who had been there felt that a line had been drawn, not just over a crown, but also over how the family will interact in the future. The monarchy as an institution had survived, but the family had not come out of it unhurt. These were the price of the clash between personal feelings and public symbols. Things that represent history may be just as dangerous as speeches. In the end, the crown was a symbol of more than one woman's life. It was a place where memories were fought over, and it would change how the monarchy portrayed itself as it entered a new era. The war had been won on principle, but the triumph was not without casualty, a rupture of trust, and an echo of bitterness that would stay like an old bruise, evident to those who maintained the home, and recalled how easily a treasured thing could cleave family from kin. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed the video, please like, subscribe, and share it.